So today we'll be talking about dyslexia, which is one of the more controversial and difficult topics that we cover, insofar as there's no clear explanation that will make sense straight away. Now, dyslexia is a term that most people will recognise as a difficulty or disorder whereby the person has problems with letters and symbols and stuff like that. But the actual definition doesn't really exist, in a sense that all the medical experts and psychologists and things like that can 100% agree on. And in fact, I guess a little disclaimer here that a lot of well, maybe not a lot, but some people do argue whether dyslexia even exists. But that's probably beyond any discussion we'll have here. So if you want to have a look at that kind of stuff, and then certainly type that into Google. We certainly teach dyslexia and some of the strategies here with the definition that it's involving difficulties with words, specifically usually spelling, and symbols associated with words like letters, to the point where the student needs additional help. So help more so than most other students in the class. Now, a lot of people do have dyslexia, which is one reason why many people argue that it doesn't really exist. And a lot of people have dyslexia and function perfectly well, and it's not an issue. There's no standardized test for dyslexia. There's no test that everyone in the world agrees is the correct measurement for whether someone has dyslexia or not. And that compares to, say, autism, or even Down syndrome is even easier. So if you look at someone with Down syndrome, you can say, that person clearly has Down syndrome, whereas dyslexia is a little more difficult for us to nail down. So I want you to think of dyslexia as just being an overarching term that groups together people who need additional help with things like spelling. And of course it involves processing. We were talking about processing earlier. It doesn't necessarily involve any visual or hearing problems. So a person with dyslexia doesn't necessarily have an issue with their eyesight or an issue with their hearing, but they will have an issue in the brain. So it's a neurological problem. It's a problem when that information arrives in the brain. Okay? So dyslexia is difficulties with decoding language. So decoding means interpreting and processing. Phonological processing. So phonological is the sound. Phonological just means the sound. Don't let big words like that confuse you. There's plenty of them in education, but it just means sounds. Writing and spelling, receptive and expressive. And receptive obviously means information coming from words and sounds and things like that, coming from one person or through a TV or whatever to you, and how you process that in your brain. So you're receiving that information and expressing that information as well. So bearing in mind that some people who have certain problems or difficulties have different levels of receptive and expressive ability. So they may be able to understand everything perfectly well like anyone else can, but then expressing it is the problem, or it could be vice versa. Handwriting and sometimes maths, although typically there is another disorder that we don't discuss here with maths. It's a neurological based condition. Neurological obviously mean it's in the brain. Specific learning disability that affects the gaining and understanding of certain aspects of language. And again, I'm not sure I would agree with that definition where it says specific, because no two people with dyslexia are the same. It affects people very differently. Some people can be, for example, extremely intelligent and go on and be professors and so forth, and have big problems with dyslexia. whereas other people will struggle with even the most basic words. Okay, so there's a little bit of information here, some diagrams. Please look those up on Google if you really want to find out more about how the brain works and dyslexia and all the actual physiological effects. Difficulty with learning to read and decoding meaning from written text. We've already been through that in the previous slide. A common misconception is that dyslexia is only about mixing words up. Now, remember what I was saying before, that dyslexia is this catch-all type term that really is trying to put people into a category if they have significant problems with symbols. Now, remember that we don't read or write as a natural skill. So that's something that we learn and something that we've developed, humans have developed over the years. Speaking is obviously a natural skill, and communication and language verbally, but the actual process of putting things on paper and looking at what those symbols are and interpreting them is not as natural a skill as being able to verbally speak. So if you look at a child who's 3 years old, they won't be able to write to anywhere near the level that they can speak or especially understand. So dyslexia is all about symbols and mixing up those symbols. And of course, a letter is a symbol, a Japanese character is a symbol, words are sort of symbols to themselves, and individual symbols put together to form a larger symbol that has particular meaning, and we attach different meaning to different words. The part of the brain that normally decodes writing and symbols is not used is not used in the dyslexic brain. Again, that's very, very simplistic, but the idea is that when information is in the brain, when it reaches the brain, so when the lines and dots and crosses and things like that you see on a piece of paper, when that visual information reaches the actual brain, it needs to be processed into something that we can understand. That's where the problem occurs. Decoding is visual for a dyslexic person, and the picture part of the brain does the decoding. So if you really want to look into the medical side of things, quite controversial, lots of different points of view about how exactly a person's brain works with dyslexia. And you know, at the end of the day, I think it doesn't really matter for us as much. For us as educational professionals, we just need to know what the strategies are, a little bit about the basics, but so long as you know that something slightly different is happening in the brain of people with dyslexia. Now, a little disclaimer here, you will come across a lot of students who claim to have dyslexia, a lot of children, a lot of parents who say that their kids have dyslexia, and that's a very different kettle of fish to those who are formally diagnosed by say a pediatrician or a psychologist or someone like that. So there are people that have characteristics. There are people that are just slightly behind, temporarily behind maybe. They have missed a year of schooling due to illness or something like that. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have dyslexia. So bear that in mind if people do tell you that they have dyslexia. As an English teacher myself, I've come across many, many students who I wouldn't have diagnosed them as dyslexia at all, and after teaching them for a long, long period of time, months, sometimes years, I find out that allegedly they have dyslexia. So sometimes whether they're diagnosed or not, or whether they claim to have it, can mean lots of different things. And then you come across students who do have severe problems, and it's very obvious, and adults as well. And you'll notice that spelling is quite poor, handwriting is quite poor, things like that. Whereas other students, obviously, it's less severe. And as we were talking about, the scale that you'll see, the spectrum that you'll see with most disabilities, some people are a 1 out of 10 and some people are certainly a 10 out of 10. It can vary, and it does depend on other disabilities and what subject they're in, and other contexts. So, for example, as I said before, if a child's missed out on a bit of education through illness because they might have, say, another disability. Okay, and it does not affect intelligence. Although, I mean, dyslexia itself does not affect intelligence, but any disability or disorder that can affect learning over the long period will obviously affect a person's ability to do things like problem solve and to learn more information. Because over a long period, if there is a barrier to learning, if there's something that prevents you from learning, if you find learning frustrating, then that particular person might get in trouble more often, for example, and if they're going to spend less time in the class, then over time that would probably affect their ability to solve problems, say a mathematical problem, for example. But again, per se, a child with dyslexia and a child without dyslexia are comparable from an intelligence point of view, but obviously other factors come into play here over the long term especially. Possible indicators of dyslexia. The reading level is below age, but appears bright. Learns best through hands-on experiences, although I've noticed going through these slides and through the different disabilities and doing the additional research and whatnot that just applies to every single person who does any type of education. Hands-on is very important, especially for people with a disability, or especially with people who are disadvantaged or in some way. Is great with maths, but has trouble with word problems. Now, that again, remember, this is a possible indicator, so every person is different. Thinks mainly in pictures and not in sounds. Pretty hard to figure out if that's the particular person that you've got in front of you, if that's true for them. Often mispronounces words, and again, we're talking about more so than other students or other kids in your centre. Has a lot of trouble learning sight words. So sight words are words where you don't need to sound out individual letters. Simple words like the, for example. Complains of headaches. Tends to confuse words that look alike or look very similar or actually are exactly the same word but have different meanings and slightly different spellings and stuff like that. Okay, so these are different symptoms and different experiences of people that do have dyslexia, that are classed as having dyslexia. And again, it's not like cystic fibrosis where it's medically diagnosed because doctors can clearly say, yes, you have this because all the symptoms line up, no problems. With dyslexia, it can be a little bit more difficult because there is such a great variation, and any of these neurological type disorders or difficulties are much more difficult to pin down because kids are very different and can be wide-ranging, and it can depend on the context, and sometimes it's a temporary developmental issue, and other times it can be a lifelong severe impact. Words can be grouped together, so that would be how they could be reading a sentence or writing a sentence. Words can circle, become washed over. Words and sentences in something of a wave. Words can blur together, and the picture of the wave further down the bottom there, so you can see how that would be confusing to read. Letters and words can become shaky, and letters can overlap. Seems a little redundant, little dots poking up here. Okay, high chance of family history of learning problems. So if mum or dad, brothers or sisters, or auntie and uncle, for example, have problems, then there's a good chance, or at least there's more of a possibility that a child might have a similar problem. Diagnosis and the procedure for diagnosis. Now, of course, this assumes that you're the first one to notice that there is a problem. Discuss the observation with the teacher. There are some checklists on the web, but again, doing your research is important. But I think if you do think a child has a particular disability, I wouldn't be running off yelling and screaming to teachers, like it's a big emergency or anything. I'd certainly be doing a little bit of research, talking to a teacher quietly if need be, because quite often they'll already know a lot of information that you're not aware of or that they just haven't passed on to you. Refer to a psychologist. You guys obviously wouldn't be doing that. I mean, it's something where a teacher or a line manager or whatever would be talking to the teacher. Sometimes a year manager might refer the student to a school psychologist, for example. There is, I mean, the one thing with dyslexia, generally there's no funding attached to dyslexia. Disclaimer here, it depends on which state you're in and the programs available and so on. But in general, in a school, things like autism and other more severe disorders like Down syndrome and that obviously attract funding. So schools get quite a lot of funding per student. But dyslexia certainly isn't one where schools have funding for education assistance in most cases, although quite often with NAPLAN these days there is additional funding available. Independent schools can use funding in different ways, but typically under the old system, under the traditional system, I guess, funding comes in for various different means, and generally learning disorders per se aren't allocated the extra $35,000 a year or whatever schools get for the higher needs students. There are pre-assessment options available. These are through private associations. So basically, I mean, parents can obviously send students to a wide variety of professionals, and some of which are a lot more, quite often in the waiting lists are quite extensive. Some famous people with dyslexia, you can Google that and find out more if you'd like. Now, as with all kids, of course, using the different strategies we've talked about, and even if you end up going on teaching adults, the strategies are all the same. Using a wide variety of tasks. So I'm not a big fan of learning styles in the sense that I don't think we should be teaching any one learning style or two learning styles. I think variety is the key. So using musical instruments and sounds and lyrics and things like that. And it also helps to engage students, but going from that to also doing silent reading, to also doing tactile or kinesthetic activities where they're touching and playing with objects and things like that, to visual learners where they're watching something on a screen, to peer-to-peer, small group work, things like that. So I think a variety of activities is really, really important. And when people go into the real world, when they actually start having to do things to earn a living, they often don't get a choice in how they learn or how they complete activities or how they learn to do new things so that they complete those activities. Okay, so difficulties with dyslexia. So some of the problems associated with dyslexia, not necessarily directly related to it, but other issues such as how they interact with their peers, bullying, teasing, work avoidance. So work avoidance is a big problem with students with, not so much with disabilities, but especially a problem with people that have are sort of borderline, so they're not diagnosed necessarily, or they just fit into the category, or they don't necessarily have all the different symptoms, but they do have one. So they're typically the children that don't have the support because they're not funded. They don't fall into the category. They don't get the extra money for the extra support. So they're the ones that can fall between the cracks, I guess, and they're just the one or two kids in the class that don't see counsellors or psychologists and those types of things. But you can sort of still tell that, okay, there's something not quite right there. Maybe they have dyslexia, but it's not to that extreme level, and maybe because of that, they know that they're not very good at writing, so they may avoid doing it, and they may avoid it by getting in trouble. Low self-esteem. And that happens with, school is about being able to learn things and write things and so on. So if a child can't do that and they have to go there 5 or 6 hours every day, 5 days a week for what would seem like forever, then obviously they would have low self-esteem. And generally, people with high self-esteem do not misbehave in schools. The biggest problem with kids who misbehave, or the reason for misbehaviour, is quite often low self-esteem. And that happens with adults as well. If you're good at something, even if it's the most boring topic in the world, you'll want to do more of it, and you'll want to be recognised for it, and you'll take pride in what you do. But if you're not very good at it, you'll avoid it, and you'll hate doing it, and you'll do everything in your power to avoid doing it until next week or until tomorrow, until later on. You'll procrastinate. And kids do exactly the same thing. Spelling reversals, repetitions, omissions, phonetic spelling issues, substituting numbers for letters, directional confusion, so that's with left to right, right to left, those types of things. Slow speed for reading, poor punctuation and grammar, comprehension, reads and rereads without actually understanding the text. Now, a lot of people do that. A lot of people will read a whole go on autopilot and read a whole page in a book, for example, and then not be able to remember it all or not be able to understand it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that person has dyslexia. What they're talking about here is, again, the processing. So what happens in the brain if a student tries to read something and no matter how many times they read it, it's just not registering upstairs. Poor memory. Finds it difficult to summarise information. Which actually we've had questions before for our adult learners in our Cert 3s and 4s and diplomas where, summarise this chapter and stuff like that. And we actually find that that is an extremely difficult task. A lot of people have a lot of problems summarising a particular chapter. So again, don't expect too much of kids because there's a lot of things that most adults can't do as well. So, and I always, people say, well, adults, kids these days can't spell. I always like to pull out the word definitely and ask people if they could spell it, because 99 out of 100 adults can't spell the word definitely. But yeah, we're quite happy to bash schools on the media all the time and say that they're doing such a poor job in literacy, and literacy's horrible these days compared to the past, but in actual reality, I'm not so sure if that's the case. Planning, organisational skills and time management can be a problem as well. Okay, so next slide, labels. We'll get through this one pretty quick. Now, one of the arguments of why students should or should not be formally diagnosed, is because of being labelled. Now, this is not just a dyslexia problem or issue. This is something that it happens with all disorders, and ADHD is one, for example. So if you label a child with dyslexia, then that's something that they have with them for the rest of their life. They will think of themselves as dyslexic, and that can obviously have lifelong effects. They may, for example, say, well, I can't do that because I'm dyslexic. And it may be the case, but it also may be the case that they're using that as an excuse. So sometimes parents, teachers, don't want to actually label kids. They don't want to have them formally diagnosed. Now, that obviously causes a whole lot of problems in many respects, because sometimes kids clearly do have problems, and with that label, on the other hand, comes funding, comes additional resources, comes additional support, and so on and so forth. I think we'll just skip that one. Okay, so treatment. Now, generally there is no treatment for dyslexia. So there's no magic pill. There are obviously other disorders that affect language. Aphasia, for example, is not being able to remember words. Now, if a person gets to the point where they really can't remember words and they're significantly struggling way beyond dyslexia, they can't form sentences, they can't say, I would like a banana, they're almost getting to the stage where it's kind of dementia-like, then obviously there are medications and so on. But that's beyond, that's going to the next level and way beyond dyslexia, which is not so much about recalling stuff, but being mixing it up and confusing it and things like that. But in general, there is no medical treatment for dyslexia. In saying that, there's always a lot of people will try natural things, but you can do your own research in that regard. Family and peers are taught to assist the child, so that's helping with homework, that's letting, and I'm a big fan of those peer strategies, peer-to-peer strategies, where you've got a friend teaching the child or helping the child through some of the activities during the day. So some schools do it where you've got a year 6 will help out with a year 3 class and they'll teach them things and so forth. And there's a completely different dynamic there as far as behaviour management goes. And as far as the topics are concerned, having one peer teach another how to play a particular sport, for example, it's an interesting strategy and certainly one that is worth trying, especially if it works, then why not continue it? Because sometimes we certainly learn a lot from our friends, and we certainly learn a lot by observing other people. And it does, of course, help with things like social skills. If systems interfere with daily function, then there is the possibility of medication. I mean, I'm really not 100% sure if that's completely true as far as dyslexia go. I've never really heard of anyone on dyslexia taking medication for dyslexia, but for other conditions, certainly so. Other conditions that may worsen dyslexia or may be related. Cognitive behaviour intervention. So cognitive just means the brain. So of course you're talking about different types of therapy there and different types of programs and things like that. So there are lots and lots of different programs out there. There's always a new miracle program that you hear of on, the current affair type shows, Today Tonight and things like that. There are lots of different programs out there, and I think that's beyond the realm of this discussion, but certainly if you're working with kids on a regular basis, if you're an EA or childcare worker and you're spending a lot of time working with kids that need help with literacy, then it's definitely worth the extra research. Obviously, reading might come quite easy for most people, but for people with dyslexia or who have certain problems with symbols and getting things mixed up, they really have to strain their brain to make sense of simple sentences, and of course that means after 10 or 15 minutes they can be absolutely exhausted. So compared to other people who may quite happily sit down and just relax and read a book for 10 or 15 minutes. So allowing for extra breaks, allowing for the fact that they may not be able to concentrate for as long. Give a handout prior so the student has extra time to read and make sense. So if you're in a childcare centre and you're going to do an activity to do with music and you're going to go through some lyrics, maybe give the parent the lyrics the night before, for example. Use summaries for each section. And checking for understanding. So checking for understanding is all about asking those follow-up questions after you've gone through activities with kids, and something you should be doing continuously, whether they have disabilities or not, or dyslexia. But using strategies, using a variety of training methods and strategies, videos, demonstration, hands-out, same as we were talking before, trying lots of different strategies, lots of different activities and seeing what works. And again, education is, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. Education is about helping the next generation, and you're learning from the past generation. So look on the internet, ask people, read the books, find out what strategies work. And remember that a lot of the strategies that work for one disability will work for another. A lot of the strategies that work for neurotypical kids or kids that have no neurological issues per se, a lot of those strategies will work as well. You just need to change them up a little bit. Allow time for sharing ideas and thoughts about tasks, so being able to discuss things, additional time to complete tasks, and assessment strategies. So allowing extended time for tests. So this is your, making adjustments for more formal assessments if you're ever involved in that. Identifying alternative formats such as video, recording oral answers, and having a scribe. So again, if you're doing an assessment, really thinking about, and we do this a lot as trainers, thinking about, well, what is it that we want? We actually want the information, or do we want them to demonstrate they additionally have the English language skills and so forth, or do we want them to demonstrate the IT skills or so forth? And if it's only the information you want, then what does it matter what format it comes to you in? Free from distractions, so they may need a quiet, cozy place, even just sitting outside the classroom, for example, or in the back corner. Keep written questions short, bullet points. Sometimes activities can have more instructions than the activity. I see that again in a lot of the assessments we look at, that especially at higher level courses, your diploma, advanced diploma, sometimes you've got to read 2 pages worth of stuff to know what you actually need to do for the particular assessment, that may only take you half a page to do. So trying to keep your questions short, to the point, is very important. All right, and that's it. Now, again, please do your research. If you're working in this particular field, then I think bear in mind that we've only covered the basics here, and we have spoken about a few of the issues with dyslexia and some of my experiences in schools. But I just want to get across the most important thing with dyslexia is remembering that it's got to do with symbols, okay? And symbols are letters and numbers and words, and those types of things, and confusing those symbols and getting them mixed up, or not interpreting them properly, or taking a little bit longer to interpret them, and so forth. Okay, so just bear that in mind, that it's a catch-all type term that means anyone who has problems with those symbols, and problems to a certain level, problems where it becomes a serious issue that affects their learning and their ability to interact with the world. But as with any of these disabilities, and this one especially so, people may be borderline. So they may be on that level where they don't quite have dyslexia, but they kind of do, but they kind of don't. They haven't been diagnosed. We've discussed some of the reasons for and against diagnosis, only the very, very basics of it. So you may come across kids who are just in mainstream classes. They don't have dyslexia, but you do notice some aspects of it, and you can certainly come up with solutions and strategies to assist them.